The wind howled across the frozen landscape of Kepler 442b as 24 students from 12 different alien species gathered in a circle. Jake Morrison stood among them, the only human in the group, looking small and fragile compared to his classmates. His breath came out in white puffs as the temperature began to drop rapidly. The sun was setting, and soon this planet would become one of the coldest places in the galaxy. Instructor Vexthal towered above them all. His crystal body caught the last rays of sunlight, throwing rainbow patterns across the icy ground. He was from the Crystalline Empire, a species that had evolved on frozen worlds much like this one. His voice boomed across the empty wilderness as he explained the rules of the night trial. "Students of the Galactic Academy," Vexthal began, his words creating small clouds of vapor in the cold air, "tonight you will face your greatest challenge yet. The temperature on this planet will drop to -40 degrees Celsius. You must survive until dawn using only what nature provides. No technology, no artificial heat sources, no help from your instructors." Jake pulled his thin academy jacket tighter around his body. Unlike his classmates, he had no natural defenses against the cold. The Zephyrians next to him were covered in thick silver fur that sparkled with ice crystals. Their home planet was an ice world where temperatures never rose above freezing. They looked comfortable, almost relaxed. On his other side stood 3 Krulin students. These tall, red-skinned beings had internal organs that generated heat, much like tiny furnaces inside their bodies. Steam rose from their skin even in the bitter cold. One of them, a student named Jürgen, glanced at Jake with what looked like pity. "Poor human," Jürgen whispered to his friend. "He will not last 2 hours in this cold. His species evolved on a warm planet. They have no fur, no internal heat, no natural protection at all." The ethereal wisps floated above the group, their translucent bodies glowing with soft blue light. They were energy beings who could convert pure thought into heat. Even now, Jake could feel waves of warmth coming from them as they prepared for the trial. There were also students from the metallic drone civilization, beings who looked like walking robots but were actually living creatures with metal skin. Their bodies contained power cells that could generate heat for days. They stood perfectly still, already beginning to conserve energy for the long night ahead. Jake counted the other species in his head, the rock-like granite people from the mountain worlds, the plant-based verdant ones who could slow their metabolism to almost nothing, the amphibious aquatic dwellers who could regulate their body temperature like Earth's cold-blooded animals. Each species had evolved perfect solutions for surviving an extreme cold. And then there was Jake, just a human. No special abilities, no evolutionary advantages, no natural defenses. He was wearing the same thin academy uniform as everyone else, but while his classmates had backup systems, Jake had only his human brain and whatever he could find in the wilderness. Instructor Vexthal continued his speech. "This trial has been used for over 1,000 years to test new species joining the Galactic Coalition. Many have failed. Those who cannot maintain their core body temperature will be rescued, but they will fail the course and must return to their homeworlds." The instructor's crystal eyes swept across the group. "You may begin now. Remember, only natural materials and your species' inherent abilities are allowed. Survival of the fittest will determine who is worthy of joining our great alliance." As soon as Vexthal finished speaking, the students scattered in different directions. The Zephyrians immediately huddled together, their fur creating a natural insulation barrier. The Krulin students began looking for caves or rocky overhangs where they could trap their body heat. The ethereal wisps floated higher, searching for wind patterns that would help them conserve energy. Jake stood alone for a moment, watching his classmates rush away. The cold was already biting through his thin clothes, and he could feel his fingers starting to go numb. But instead of panicking, he began to study the environment around him. The landscape was mostly flat with scattered rocks and boulders of different sizes. There were patches of dried grass and small shrubs, most of them covered with a thin layer of frost. In the distance he could see a few twisted trees, their branches bare and brittle-looking, While the other students focused on finding shelter, Jake began walking slowly across the area, examining everything he saw. He picked up different types of stones, testing their weight and density. He touched the bark of trees, feeling for dryness. He looked at the grass and vegetation, searching for materials that would burn well. Creolox, one of the Zephyrian students, called out to him, "Human Jake, you should join our group. Your species lacks natural insulation. We can share our body heat with you." Jake smiled and waved back. "Thanks, but I think I have an idea." The Zephyrians looked at each other with confusion. What could a human possibly know about surviving in extreme cold that they did not? Their species had lived on frozen worlds for millions of years. They were experts at cold weather survival. As the temperature continued to drop, Jake began collecting specific types of rocks. He was not grabbing them randomly. He looked for stones that were dense and solid, avoiding any that had cracks or seemed to have holes in them. He tested each rock by tapping it with another stone, listening to the sound it made. The other students watched him with growing curiosity. Lumana, an ethereal wisp, floated closer to observe. "What is the human doing?" she whispered to her companions. "He is gathering stones instead of seeking shelter. Does he plan to build a wall?" Jake continued his methodical collection while his classmates struggled with the dropping temperature. Several alien students were already showing signs of distress. Even species that were naturally adapted to cold were having trouble with the planet's extreme conditions. The human began arranging his stones in a careful pattern near a small depression in the ground. Then he started gathering dry grass, small twigs, and pieces of bark from the surrounding area. His movements were quick but purposeful, as if he was following a plan that only he understood. Why, or single quote scan. The Krulan student watched from a distance, with growing skepticism. "Look at the human," he said to his friends. "He is trying to make fire like a primitive creature. Does he not understand that a small flame cannot protect him from this cold? Our internal heat generators are already struggling, and they are far more advanced than simple fire." But Jake was not discouraged by the comments. He had learned about survival from his grandfather, who had been a wilderness expert on Earth. The old man had taught him that humans survived not because they were the strongest or fastest, but because they were smart and resourceful. Using 2 pieces of dry wood, Jake began the slow process of creating fire through friction. He had practiced this technique many times during his training on Earth, but never in such extreme conditions. His fingers were numb from the cold, making it difficult to maintain the steady rhythm needed to generate heat. The alien students gathered around to watch, their own survival efforts temporarily forgotten. They had never seen anyone try to create fire without modern technology. Most species had abandoned such primitive techniques thousands of years ago. Jake worked steadily, ignoring the cold and the curious stares of his classmates. Slowly, a thin line of smoke began to rise from the wood. Then, a tiny orange spark appeared. Jake carefully fed the spark with dry grass and small twigs, gradually building it into a small but steady flame. The other students gasped in amazement. Fire danced in the darkness, providing both light and warmth. But Jake's expression showed that his work was far from finished. He had much more to do before the long, cold night was over. The small fire crackled and popped as Jake fed it more dry wood and grass. Orange light danced across the faces of the alien students who had gathered around to watch. The warmth felt good against their cold skin, but most of them still believed the human was making a mistake. A simple fire would not be enough to survive the long, brutal night ahead. Jake ignored their doubtful looks and continued with his plan. He carefully placed several of the stones he had collected around the edge of his fire. These were not random rocks. He had chosen each one carefully, looking for specific types that would hold heat well without cracking or exploding when heated. "The human is wasting time," muttered Zolther, one of the metallic drone students. His metal skin was already beginning to frost over despite his internal power systems. "He should be building a shelter or finding a cave. That little fire will die out in a few hours." But Jake was not worried about the fire dying. He had a different plan, one that his alien classmates did not understand yet. While they huddled together and activated their natural defenses, Jake worked steadily on his project. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since the trial began. Several students were already in serious trouble. 3 aquatic dwellers had moved closer to Jake's fire, their amphibious skin turning blue from the cold. Even with their ability to regulate body temperature, they were struggling against the planet's extreme conditions. "Please," one of them said to Jake, "can we stay near your fire? Our temperature regulation is failing." Jake nodded and gestured for them to come closer. "Of course. There's room for everyone." This surprised the other students. The trial was supposed to be a competition, with only the strongest surviving. But Jake seemed more interested in helping others than winning for himself. While the aquatic dwellers warmed themselves by the fire, Jake began the next phase of his plan. He started digging into the partially frozen ground using a sharp stone as a tool. The earth was hard and difficult to break, but Jake worked steadily, creating a narrow pit about 3 feet deep. The alien students watched in confusion. Why was the human digging a hole? Some of them whispered among themselves, trying to understand his strategy. "Maybe he is trying to hide underground," suggested Lumana, the ethereal wisp. Her translucent body was glowing brighter as she used more energy to stay warm. "Or perhaps he plans to bury himself like some primitive creature," added Jurgen, the Krulin student. Despite his internal heat generation, even he was feeling the effects of the dropping temperature. Jake continued digging, his breath coming out in thick white clouds. His hands were numb from the cold, but he did not stop. He had learned this technique from his grandfather, who had survived in the wilderness of Alaska during Earth's harshest winters. As Jake worked, more alien students began to struggle. The verdant ones, who were plant-based life forms, were moving very slowly as they tried to conserve energy. Their green skin was turning brown at the edges, a sign that they were beginning to freeze. 2 of the granite people, who looked like walking rocks, had found a small cave and were huddled inside. But even their stone-like bodies were not enough protection against the planet's brutal cold. Frost was forming on their surfaces, and their movements were becoming sluggish. The Zephyrians, despite their thick fur, were also having problems. Their breath was creating ice crystals that were freezing to their whiskers. They pressed closer together, trying to share body heat, but Jake could see that they were scared. "This planet is colder than our homeworld," Creolox admitted to his fellow Zephyrians. "Our fur is not thick enough for these temperatures." Jake looked up from his digging to see his classmates struggling. The competitive nature of the trial seemed less important now. These were his friends and fellow students, and they were suffering. "Listen, everyone," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the frozen landscape. "I have an idea that might help all of us survive, but I need to finish this first." He pointed to the stones that had been heating in his fire. They were now glowing with absorbed heat, radiating warmth that could be felt several feet away. Jake carefully removed one of the stones using 2 pieces of wood as tools. The rock was too hot to touch with bare hands, but it contained enough thermal energy to provide heat for hours. The alien students watched in amazement as Jake placed the heated stone at the bottom of his pit. He covered it with a layer of dry grass and earth, then added another hot stone on top. He repeated this process several times, creating layers of heated stones and insulating material. "Incredible," breathed Zolther. "The human is creating a thermal storage system using only natural materials." Jake nodded as he worked. "My grandfather taught me this technique." He called it a thermal pit. You use fire to heat stones, then the stones release their heat slowly over many hours. It's like a natural heating system. As Jake continued building his thermal pit, he explained the process to his fascinated classmates. "The key is choosing the right stones. They need to be dense, so they can hold heat, but they cannot have cracks or air pockets, or they might explode when heated." Several alien students moved closer to watch and learn. Even Jurgen, who had been skeptical of human methods, was paying careful attention. "You also need to insulate the stones properly," Jake continued. "The grass and earth act like a blanket, keeping the heat from escaping too quickly. If you do it right, the stones will stay warm all night. Jake placed more heated stones in his pit, building up layers of thermal mass and insulation. The concept was simple but effective. He was essentially creating a battery that stored heat instead of electrical energy. As he worked, Jake noticed that several of his classmates were shivering violently. The ethereal wisps were flickering weakly, their energy reserves running low. Some of the metallic drone students were making worried clicking sounds as their power systems struggled. "There's room for more people," Jake announced. "I can teach you how to make your own thermal pits." This offer shocked the other students. In a competitive trial where only the fittest were supposed to survive, Jake was offering to share his knowledge with potential rivals. "Why would you help us?" asked Lumana, her translucent form shimmering with cold. "This is a test of individual survival." Jake looked around at his struggling classmates. "Because survival is not just about being the strongest. It's about being smart, working together, and sharing knowledge. My species learned that lesson a long time ago." He gestured to the stones heating in his fire. "There are plenty of rocks here for everyone. The fire can heat stones for multiple thermal pits. We can all survive this night if we work together." The alien students looked at each other uncertainly. They had been taught that competition was the natural order, that only the strongest deserved to survive. But Jake was offering a different approach, one based on cooperation and shared knowledge. One by one, the students began to accept Jake's offer. The aquatic dwellers were the first to ask for help, followed by the struggling verdant ones. Even some of the Zephyrians admitted that they needed additional warmth beyond their natural fur. Jake smiled as he began teaching his classmates the ancient human art of thermal pit construction. "First, you need to find the right stones," he explained, showing them how to test rocks for density and structural integrity. "Then you dig your pit to the right size and depth." As the night grew colder and darker, the alien students found themselves learning survival techniques that their advanced civilizations had long forgotten. Under Jake's patient guidance, they began to understand that primitive did not mean ineffective, and that sometimes the oldest solutions were the best ones. The temperature had dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, and the alien students were beginning to panic. Even those with natural advantages were struggling against the planet's brutal cold. Jake's small fire provided a warm circle of light in the darkness, but it was the only source of heat for miles around. Jake finished placing the last heated stone in his thermal pit and covered it with a final layer of insulating material. The pit was now complete, containing enough stored heat to keep him warm through the entire night. But as he looked around at his struggling classmates, he knew he could not rest yet. 3 ethereal wisps were flickering weakly near the fire, their energy reserves nearly exhausted. Their translucent bodies had lost most of their blue glow, and they were barely floating above the ground. On their homeworld, they could absorb energy from their star, but here in the darkness, they were slowly fading. "We cannot maintain our heat generation much longer," Lumana whispered, her voice weak and shaky. "Our energy levels are dropping too fast." Jake nodded and gestured toward a pile of stones he had prepared. "Let me show you how to make your own thermal pit. It will give you heat all night without using your own energy." He began teaching Lumana and her companions the technique. "First, you need to dig a pit that fits your body size. For you, it should be wider since you float rather than lie down." The ethereal wisps watched carefully as Jake demonstrated the digging process. Their energy-based bodies could not touch solid matter directly, but they could use their power to move earth and stones. Working together, they managed to create a shallow depression in the frozen ground. "Now we heat the stones," Jake explained, placing several rocks around his fire. "The key is to get them very hot, but not so hot that they crack. You can tell when they are ready because they will glow slightly and radiate heat." While the stones heated, Jake helped the ethereal wisps gather insulating materials. They used their energy to collect dry grass, small twigs, and pieces of bark. The work was exhausting for them, but Jake encouraged them to keep going. This is harder than our usual energy conversion methods, admitted one of the wisps. But we can see that your technique is more efficient for long-term heat storage. Nearby, the Zephyrian students were also asking for help. Despite their thick fur, they were shivering violently. Their breath created clouds of ice crystals that froze to their whiskers and made it difficult to breathe. "Human Jake," Creolox called out, "our fur is becoming stiff with ice. We need additional warmth or we will not survive until dawn." Jake looked at the group of furry aliens and smiled. "Your fur is actually an advantage for this technique. It will help trap the heat from the stones and keep you warm longer." He showed the Zephyrians how to dig a group thermal pit, one large enough for all of them to share. "Since you naturally huddle together, you can make one big pit and share the heated stones. Your body heat plus the stone heat will keep you very comfortable." The Zephyrians worked quickly, using their claws to dig through the frozen earth. Their natural instincts for survival kicked in as they realized Jake's method could save their lives. Soon they had created a large, shallow pit that could hold their entire group. Jake helped them place heated stones throughout the pit, creating multiple heat sources. He showed them how to arrange the stones so that the heat would distribute evenly and last as long as possible. "This is amazing," Creolox said as he felt the warmth radiating from the stones. "We have never seen such an efficient use of natural materials." As Jake worked with the Zephyrians, more students approached asking for help. The aquatic dwellers were in serious trouble. Their amphibious skin was turning blue-black and their movements were becoming sluggish. Without proper heat, they would enter a state similar to hibernation and might not wake up until spring. "Please help us," one of them pleaded. "Our temperature regulation has completely failed. We are freezing from the inside out." Jake quickly assessed their condition. The aquatic dwellers needed heat fast or they would not survive another hour. He made a decision that showed his quick thinking and compassion. "We need to get you warm immediately," he said. "I am going to share my thermal pit with you." This surprised everyone, including the aquatic dwellers themselves. Jake had worked hard to create his own survival system, and now he was offering to share it with others. But there is only room for one person," protested one of the aquatic dwellers. "If we share your pit, you might not stay warm enough." Jake shook his head. "There is room for 3 if we are careful. And I can make another pit for myself later. Right now, you need heat more than I do." He helped the 3 aquatic dwellers into his thermal pit, arranging them so that they could share the warmth of the heated stones. Their cold bodies immediately began to absorb the heat, and their blue-black skin started to return to its normal color. "Thank you," one of them whispered. "You have saved our lives." Jake smiled and began building a fire to heat stones for a new thermal pit. "That is what friends do. We help each other survive." Word of Jake's generosity spread quickly among the alien students. Soon, a line of struggling students formed near his fire, all hoping to learn the thermal pit technique. Jake worked tirelessly, teaching each group the proper methods. The granite people were next. Their rock-like bodies were covered with frost, and their movements were becoming slow and clumsy. Jake showed them how to create a thermal pit that would work with their heavy, stone-like forms. "Your bodies are naturally good at holding heat," he explained. "Once you absorb warmth from the stones, you will stay warm longer than other species." The granite people worked slowly but steadily, their stone fingers scraping through the frozen earth. Jake helped them place extra-large heated stones in their pit, knowing that their massive bodies would need more thermal energy, even the proud. Krulin students, who had initially dismissed Jake's methods, were forced to ask for help. Their internal heat generation was failing against the planet's extreme cold. Steam no longer rose from their red skin, and they were beginning to shiver. Like everyone else, YOR single quote scan approached Jake with obvious reluctance. "Human," he said quietly, "our heat generation organs are not working properly in this cold. We ... We need to learn your technique." Jake looked at the Krulin student without any sign of smugness or superiority. "Of course everyone deserves to survive this night. He taught the Krulin students how to create thermal pits that would supplement their natural heat production. Your internal heat plus the stone heat will make you very comfortable, he explained. Think of it as a backup system. As Jake worked with the Krulin students, he noticed that something amazing was happening. The competitive atmosphere of the trial was disappearing. Students from different species were working together, sharing materials and helping each other dig pits. The metallic drone students used their superior strength to move heavy stones. The ethereal wisps used their energy to gather insulating materials. The Zephyrians shared their knowledge of insulation techniques. Everyone was contributing something to the group effort. This is remarkable, observed Zolther, one of the metallic drone students. We came here to compete against each other, but instead we are learning to work together. Jake nodded as he placed another heated stone in a thermal pit. Competition has its place, but cooperation is how species really survive. My people learned that lesson long ago. As the night reached its coldest point, all 24 students had working thermal pits. The alien students settled into their warm shelters, amazed at how comfortable they felt despite the brutal conditions outside. The planet's temperature had reached its lowest point of -40 degrees Celsius. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly under a sky filled with alien stars. But around Jake's fire, something wonderful was happening. 24 students from 12 different species were not just surviving. They were thriving. Jake settled into his second thermal pit, feeling the gentle warmth of the heated stones against his body. The pit worked perfectly, maintaining a comfortable temperature, despite the brutal cold outside. But what made him happiest was not his own comfort, but the sight of his classmates resting peacefully in their own thermal shelters. The ethereal wisps floated quietly in their wide, shallow pit. Their bodies had regained their blue glow as they conserved energy while the heated stones provided warmth. Lumana drifted closer to the edge of their pit and called softly to Jake. "Human Jake," she said, her voice stronger than it had been hours earlier. "This thermal pit method is more sophisticated than we first understood. Our species has always relied on energy conversion, but your technique is far more efficient for long-term survival." Jake smiled and adjusted his position in his own pit. "My grandfather always said that the best solutions are often the simplest ones. Heat goes into the stones when they are in the fire, and then the stones give that heat back slowly. It is just like a battery, but for warmth instead of electricity." Nearby, the Zephyrian students were sleeping comfortably in their large group pit. Their thick fur, combined with the radiant heat from multiple stones, had created the perfect environment for their species. Krelox opened one eye and looked toward Jake's pit. "We owe you a great debt," Krelox whispered, trying not to wake his sleeping companions. "Without your knowledge, several of us would not have survived this night. Our people will want to learn these techniques." The aquatic dwellers had recovered completely from their earlier crisis. Their skin had returned to its normal color, and they were breathing normally again. They had arranged themselves carefully in Jake's original thermal pit, sharing the warmth while leaving room for each other to move. "This is better than our heated pools at home," one of them said quietly. "The stone heat penetrates deep into our bodies. We feel warm all the way through." Jake felt proud as he listened to his classmates. But his proudest moment came when he heard voices from the Krulon. "Students' thermal pit?" Jurgen, who had been so dismissive of human methods earlier, was having a quiet conversation with his friends. "I was wrong about the human," Jurgen admitted to his fellow Krulon students. "I thought their techniques were primitive because they seemed simple." "But simple does not mean stupid. This thermal pit method is actually brilliant engineering," his friend nodded in agreement. "The human understood something we did not. He knew that natural materials could be used in ways we never considered. Our heat generation organs work well, but they use energy constantly. These stones store energy and release it without any effort from us." Jake pretended to be asleep, but he was listening to every word. It felt good to know that even the skeptical students now understood the value of human survival knowledge. As the night continued, the students began sharing more than just warmth. They started talking about their homeworlds, their cultures, and their dreams for the future. The thermal pits had created small communities where different species could learn about each other. The granite people, usually quiet and serious, began telling stories about the mountain caves where they lived. Their deep, rumbling voices carried across the frozen landscape as they described crystal formations and underground rivers. "On our world," one of them said, "we carve homes into the rock faces, but we never thought to use heated stones for warmth. We usually just rely on volcanic vents and hot springs." The metallic drone students talked about their factory cities and the complex machines they built, but they admitted that all their technology had not taught them Jake's simple but effective survival methods. "Our power cells are impressive," Zolther said, "but they require rare materials and complex manufacturing. The human's technique uses only stones, fire, and knowledge. It can be done anywhere, by anyone." The verdant ones, who were plant-based life forms, shared information about their forest worlds and how they grew food from sunlight and soil. They were fascinated by Jake's ability to create heat from natural materials. "We understand growing things," one of them said, "but we never learned to make fire or heat stones. Our species evolved to absorb energy from our sun. This human technique opens up new possibilities for us." Jake listened to all these conversations and felt amazed at how much the different species were learning from each other. The trial had started as a competition to see who was strongest, but it had become something much more valuable. It had become a chance for different worlds to share knowledge and build friendships. Around midnight, Jake decided to check on all the thermal pits to make sure everyone was staying warm. He climbed out of his own pit and walked carefully across the frozen ground. The stones in each pit were still radiating heat, and all the students seemed comfortable and safe. When he reached the ethereal wisp's pit, Lumana floated up to speak with him privately. "Jake," she said, "I want you to know that what you did tonight changed everything. You could have kept your knowledge to yourself and won the trial easily. Instead, you chose to help everyone survive." Jake shrugged, but he was touched by her words. "Where I come from, we believe that knowledge should be shared. My grandfather taught me survival techniques, and his grandfather taught him. If I kept the knowledge to myself, it would die with me." Lumana's translucent form shimmered with what looked like emotion. "Your species has a wisdom that goes beyond technology or evolution. You understand that survival is not just about individual strength, but about community and cooperation." As Jake continued his rounds, he noticed something that made him smile. Students from different species were talking across the gaps between their thermal pits. The Zephyrians were sharing jokes with the granite people. The aquatic dwellers were teaching the metallic drones songs from their homeworld. The trial had brought together species that normally had little contact with each other. They came from different star systems, had evolved in completely different environments, and had never had reason to cooperate before tonight. When Jake reached the Krulin student's pit, Jürgen called him over. "Human," Jürgen said, "I want to apologize for my earlier words. I judged your species based on appearances rather than abilities. Tonight you have shown me that intelligence and creativity are more important than natural advantages." Jake sat down next to the pit, feeling the warmth radiating from the stones inside. "No apology needed. Everyone judges others sometimes. The important thing is that we all learned something tonight." Jürgen nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, we learned about thermal pits and heat storage. But we also learned about something more important. We learned about sharing knowledge and helping others, even when they are supposed to be competitors." As Jake walked back to his own thermal pit, he felt satisfied with the night's work. All 24 students would survive until dawn. More importantly, they had learned valuable lessons about cooperation, friendship, and the power of shared knowledge. The frozen planet continued its slow rotation, bringing them closer to sunrise with each passing hour. But the students were no longer counting the minutes until rescue. They were comfortable, warm, and surrounded by new friends from across the galaxy. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the frozen landscape of Kepler 442b. After the longest night of their lives, the alien students began to stir in their thermal pits. The heated stones had worked perfectly, keeping them warm and comfortable through the planet's brutal cold. As the temperature started to rise with the coming sunrise, they realized they had all survived the impossible trial. Jake was the first to climb out of his thermal pit. He stretched his arms and looked around at the scene before him. 24 thermal pits dotted the area around his fire, which had burned down to glowing embers during the night. Steam rose from each pit as the warm air inside met the cold morning atmosphere. One by one, the alien students emerged from their shelters. They looked rested and healthy, completely different from the scared and shivering creatures they had been the night before. The ethereal wisps glowed brightly with restored energy. The Zephyrian's fur sparkled with morning frost, but their eyes were clear and alert. Even the Krulan students looked refreshed, their red skin warm and healthy. As the students gathered around the remains of Jake's fire, they began sharing their experiences from the night. The aquatic dwellers talked about how the stone heat had penetrated deep into their bodies, warming them in ways their own temperature regulation never could. The granite people marveled at how efficiently the simple technique had worked. "I have never slept so comfortably in cold weather," admitted one of the metallic drone students. "Our power cells kept us alive, but they did not provide the deep, lasting warmth that your stones gave us." Jake smiled as he began carefully removing the cooled stones from his thermal pit. Even after a full night, many of them were still slightly warm. The best part is that you can use the same stones over and over again. Just heat them up in a fire, and they are ready to keep you warm for another night. The students watched as Jake demonstrated how to properly dismantle a thermal pit. He showed them how to save the best stones for future use and how to return the displaced Earth to its original location. Even in the wilderness, Jake believed in leaving no trace of their presence. "Your people think about the long term," observed Lumana, the ethereal wisp. "You do not just survive, you survive in a way that does not harm the environment around you." As the students worked together to clean up their thermal pits, they heard the sound of approaching aircraft. Instructor Vexthel was returning with the rescue teams, expecting to find cold, miserable students barely clinging to life. Instead, he found 24 warm, healthy, and surprisingly happy young beings. The massive crystalline instructor landed his transport vehicle and stepped out, his crystal body reflecting the early morning sunlight. He looked around in amazement at the scene before him. Not only had every single student survived the night, but they were laughing and talking together like old friends. "Remarkable," Vexthel said, his deep voice carrying across the area. "In over 200 cycles of conducting this trial, I have never seen such results. Usually at least half the students require rescue, and the survivors are exhausted and hypothermic." He walked closer to examine the remains of the thermal pits, studying the clever arrangement of stones and insulating materials. "Who developed this survival technique?" he asked. All 23 alien students pointed toward Jake, who was helping the last group pack up their thermal pit materials. The human looked up, slightly embarrassed by all the attention. "It is an old technique from my homeworld," Jake explained modestly. "My grandfather taught it to me. He learned it from his grandfather, who learned it from his grandfather." Human survival knowledge goes back thousands of years. Vexthel approached Jake with obvious respect and curiosity. "Human Jake Morrison, you have accomplished something unprecedented. Not only did you survive the trial using primitive techniques, but you shared your knowledge with every other student. You turned a competition into a cooperation." The instructor examined one of the thermal pits more closely, noting the precise placement of stones and the efficient use of insulating materials. "This is not primitive technology," he said with growing amazement. "This is sophisticated engineering using natural materials. The heat storage efficiency, the insulation design, the sustainable material usage, it rivals our most advanced systems." Jake shook his head. "It is really very simple. You just need to understand how heat moves and how different materials hold temperature. My people learned these things because we had to survive in many different environments on Earth." The other students gathered around as Vexthel continued his examination. They were proud to have learned Jake's techniques and wanted to share their experiences with their instructor. "Jake saved our lives," said one of the aquatic dwellers. "Without his thermal pit method, several of us would not have survived the night." Kreolox, the Zephyrian student, stepped forward. "He did not just share his technique with us. He taught us about cooperation and helping others, even when we are supposed to be competitors." Jürgen, the Krulen student who had been most skeptical of Jake's methods, spoke up next. "I was wrong to dismiss human techniques as primitive. This human showed me that intelligence and creativity are more valuable than natural advantages." Instructor. Vexthel listened to each student's testimony with growing interest. As an educator, he had seen many different approaches to the survival trial, but never anything like this. Usually, students focused entirely on their own survival, using whatever natural advantages their species possessed. Jake had taken a completely different approach. "Tell me, human Jake," Vexthel said, "why did you choose to help your competitors instead of focusing on your own survival?" The trial was designed to test individual capabilities. Jake thought for a moment before answering. "On my world, we have a saying, 'A rising tide lifts all boats.' It means that when you help others succeed, everyone benefits. I could have survived the night alone with my thermal pit, but helping others survive felt more important than winning a competition." The instructor nodded slowly. "Your species has a philosophy that many civilizations could learn from. You understand that true strength comes not from defeating others, but from lifting them up?" As the rescue teams prepared to transport the students back to the academy, word of the night's events began to spread. The other instructors were amazed to hear that all 24 students had not only survived, but had learned valuable new techniques. Several of them requested to examine Jake's thermal pit method for possible inclusion in the academy curriculum. During the flight back to the academy, the alien students continued discussing their experience. They had come to the trial as representatives of their individual species, focused on proving their own superiority. They were returning as friends who had learned the value of cooperation and shared knowledge. "We should stay in contact after graduation," suggested Zolther, the metallic drone student. "Our species could learn much from each other." The other students agreed enthusiastically. The thermal pit technique had brought them together, but the friendships they had formed would last much longer than the night trial. When they arrived at the academy, news of their success had already spread throughout the institution. Students and instructors gathered to hear about the human who had revolutionized the survival trial. Jake found himself surrounded by curious beings from dozens of different species, all wanting to learn about thermal pit construction. Over the following days, Jake became something of a celebrity at the academy. He was invited to give demonstrations of human survival techniques to other classes. The thermal pit method was formally added to the academy's survival curriculum, ensuring that future generations of students would benefit from human knowledge. But for Jake, the greatest reward was not the fame or recognition. It was the knowledge that he had helped his friends survive and had shown them the value of cooperation over competition. He had proven that humans, despite their lack of natural advantages, possessed something equally valuable: the wisdom to work together and share knowledge for the benefit of all.